What is up, Pitt fans? Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of the PG Pitt Show, brought to you by FanDuel. I'm Stephen Thompson. That's Abby Schnable. We both cover Pitt athletics for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And Abby, we are back on the grind after a bye week, and got Louisville set up. ACC opener coming this Saturday. But I mean, honestly, even with the off week, I think everyone's still kind of stuck on that West Virginia game. Pat Narduzzi, the first thing he says to us at this afternoon's press conference was that watching that game back made him sick. And I think a lot of Pitt fans can empathize with that. How are you feeling on this Monday afternoon?
Well, I personally am feeling great. I am not feeling great for Pitt football because that is a tough loss to have with 2 weeks in between games. And you just know that that's sitting in the back of their head, bad taste in their mouth for as long as it was. And, maybe it meant that they hit practice harder to make sure that they don't, have a repeat performance against Louisville this weekend. So, I like that they thought it was as ugly as we thought it was because, sometimes coaches mince their words, and Narduzzi did not mince his words today.
No, he didn't. And I think one of the things probably motivating him not to mince his words was because there were a number of issues. We talked about a bunch of them with our post-game analysis following that game on this channel. You can go check out that video. Make sure you're liking that video, like this video, subscribe to PG Pitt on YouTube as well. But we went over a number of issues that Pitt had last Saturday, 2 Saturdays ago in Morgantown. But, given, 2 weeks to kind of let that loss stew, you focus in on a few different things. And really the word of the day at the Pitt football facility today was execution. And so Pitt really, one of the things that made Pat Narduzzi sick was he felt like Pitt was in position to win that game, had every opportunity to win that game, and just didn't execute. They just didn't make the plays that were in front of them. And, Abby, that's how I felt really walking out of driving out of Morgantown last Saturday evening was that, there were a bunch of opportunities for Pitt to win that game and that they just did not take the chances that were in front of them. They didn't execute. They didn't make throws. They didn't make tackles. They didn't finish off plays where they had, opportunities to score touchdowns, things of that nature. They miss a field goal. They're committing penalties that are right in front of them when they're in the red zone. And, I think to a certain extent, coaching does share some of the blame. I wrote about that following the game. The coaching also shares blame for execution as well. But, I do kind of buy what Pat Narduzzi is selling to a certain extent is that, coaching was not, the biggest thing to be blamed coming out of this game. It certainly does share some of the blame, but, there were a lot of opportunities for the players on the field to give their team a better chance to win that game.
Yeah, I think we said it after the West Virginia game is that there were a lot of points left on the field, and that is essentially what comes. It's almost synonymous with execution because when your team is leaving points on the field, means that you didn't do something right. And I think we talked about this recently over the bye week or just even earlier today about there were a lot of times where it felt like, especially offensively, the receivers were in position and the ball just couldn't get to him. And whether that was because of Eli Holstein himself or the offensive line not keeping him protected enough to feel comfortable to make the throw, there were just a lot of times where it felt like on paper when you're watching it they look good, but it was once the ball was actually moving, maybe it's not as good as it is, and that's what execution comes to. And we're at the point in the season or not at the point of the season, but for a lot of these players, they are seniors, and if we're having execution issues as seniors, that's pretty problematic, especially when you look at it from the penalty standpoint, because that's discipline and execution too within and of itself. I mean, a lot of those penalties came from senior players, and I think Narduzzi said it, that needs to be cleaner. They need to be more disciplined, and they just need to, I know the defense loved to use the word finish, and I think they used it in a little bit of a different way, but it's the same thing. You got to finish what the play is drawn up. You have to execute, which is what Narduzzi said over and over and over again today.
Yeah, if you only do, run 80% of a play correctly, if you only, do 80% of a rep, that's not good enough. That's a losing rep. You have to be good all the way through. That's one of the demands of football. And Pitt certainly was not that, when they played West Virginia. And so I guess the natural question is, how does execution get better if, like you said, it's a lot of seniors committing penalties that they just should not be committing. It's throws that your starting quarterback, the one that you invested so much in, not just personnel wise, but, I'm sure financially you're making a commitment to him over the offseason because you believe in him, but in a big spot, he's not connecting on throws that you have seen him make before. The operation of the offense is not necessarily as clean. And so I guess the question is, where do improvements come from? Where can you reasonably expect the execution to get better if, we're 3 games in, we're 4 weeks in, you have a bunch of veteran players who aren't making the plays that you need them to make?
I'm going to give Eli Holstein the benefit of the doubt and say that, a good amount of his issues came from that he was rattled from the beginning. And that is something that he does need to, fix within himself of not letting himself stay rattled the whole game. But he looked a little off almost from start to finish. And so I wonder if the execution gets better for him the more comfortable he feels with this offensive line. And so I think a lot of it, for me at least, comes from the offensive line. The offensive line needs to be cleaner, and it's blocking and it's penalties and creating space for the running backs. I feel like I talk about the offensive line every single week, but I feel like a lot of Eli's issues, because that's the crux of it, really, because the receivers are in place. The running backs, for the most part, are doing their job too. And I don't know how much of this falls on Eli because of the fact that he was put into pretty crappy positions throughout the game. And now I'm not going to give him, all the excuses, because there were a lot of passes that he should have finished. He did leave a lot of points on the board. He had his receivers in places, but how much of that had to do with how flustered he was because the offensive line wasn't as sturdy of his job is where I question. And that's a hard thing because a lot of those offensive linemen are senior players. And how much can you get a senior player to execute when they've been talking about in the offseason needing to be better at protecting and needing to be better at creating lanes? And it's we're still not seeing that through game 3. And that's where I'm wondering can it actually get cleaner?
Right. I agree. Well, look, I disagree a little bit. I think I put more blame on Eli than maybe you would. But I think your point is well taken about this kind of all starting up front. We said in the offseason that if Pitt was going to get better, the offensive line had to kind of lead the way. The offensive line was going to set the stage for everything from the kind of season we had hoped to see from Eli Holstein, the kind of season we had hoped to see from Desmond Reid, and then by extension, a lot of these playmakers. Then you're not putting as much on the defense as well, and there's a snowball effect from there. But I'm with you. They're just mistakes that you did not anticipate and did not want to see your veteran offensive lineman making. The penalties really stood out from Keith Gueva and Lyndon Cooper, and maybe one fewer penalty of that from one of those guys in those situations, and you're a winner. You're not going to overtime. You have enough of an advantage going into the fourth quarter that it isn't really that blowing a 10-point lead isn't an issue. But I'm kind of in the same place as you. It's there is better depth along the offensive line, but not the kind of depth where you can say, all right, well, we've got another guy who can just come in and play, especially at, some of the positions that were, not as strong, like a right guard or or the center position or, to a lesser extent, left tackle. I don't think Ryan Baer has been necessarily stellar this year, but it's just not something that you should be counting on your veteran guys, not just on the offensive line, those seniors, but then, also kind of Eli. And I think some of the receivers had some mistakes as well. With guys this old, I don't think you should have to be developing them in season. And, that's true to a lesser extent for Eli because he is only in his second year as a starter and is really effectively a second year playing college football versus, a guy like a Lyndon Cooper. I mean, that unnecessary roughness penalty is just not something that he should ever be doing. And I really don't buy the, big, loud environment, juiced up. That is a situation where his experience has to be able to shine. and it just simply did not. So I'm in the same boat as you. I really do wonder where execution can get better. There's some natural things, like you said, they're not going to be in as charged environment this week. They probably won't play in an environment similar to what they faced in West Virginia for the rest of the year. I looking down the schedule, that's no disrespect to anyone else in the ACC, but sorry, just nothing's going to really compare to playing a backyard brawl in Morgantown. So maybe some natural stuff gets better, maybe chemistry gets better. But we had heard all offseason about how smooth the operation was. And we heard about it even in the week leading up to the game. Eli Holstein said it was one of the things that gave him the most confidence. But that continuity and that experience just did not shine through whatsoever, I would say. Honestly, I think Pitt did not look like a team that had much experience at all on the field in Morgantown.
And I think maybe the age thing and the experience thing is a little bit more why I put it on the offensive line as opposed to Eli, because he is in his second year. And yes, he shouldn't be making the mistakes that he is making. But the mistakes that the offensive line are making are really bad when you consider the fact that they have been playing as long as they have been playing. And so I agree that definitely Eli is at fault for some of this here. I think I'm just maybe giving more of the weight to the offensive line because of their age.
Before we move on, Abby, I want to make sure that we get you all this message from our friends at ZipRecruiter. Are you having trouble finding the right people to hire? Tired of sorting through endless resumes? Well, the future of hiring looks much brighter because ZipRecruiter's latest tools and features help speed up finding the right people for your roles, so you save your valuable time. And now you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/audio. That's ZipRecruiter.com/audio, AUDIO. With ZipRecruiter's new advances, you can easily find and connect with qualified candidates in minutes. See a candidate you're really interested in, you can unlock their contact info instantly. Use ZipRecruiter to save time hiring. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. And you can go to ZipRecruiter.com/audio right now to try it for free. Again, that's ZipRecruiter.com/audio. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. Well, Abby, ZipRecruiter is a solution for those of you looking to hire someone new. Pitt football can't exactly hire anyone new. So we talked about the coaching issues that we thought, maybe some poor decisions on Pat Narduzzi's part. We tend to think Kade Bell called a pretty good game on Saturday. Pat Narduzzi agreed with us as well. So let's start looking elsewhere. Maybe if we think it's going to be tough, especially at certain positions, for the execution to get better. One of the things Pat Narduzzi was asked today is, when you do have some of those older guys committing penalties, making mistakes, at what point do you start to look at personnel? And so suppose for you, where and when do you start to look at personnel as well? Because Pat Narduzzi did, I think, make a valid point. You don't extrapolate too much from one game. At the end of the day, it is one game. And so you don't want to make decisions that are too rash. And at the same time, though, we have seen him not pull a trigger when maybe the option was obvious in previous seasons at certain spots.
So I think about the fact that West Virginia was really their first true test. And so I agree with Narduzzi in that you don't want to make a lot of rash decisions, even with how bad that loss was, because I think there are a lot of good things you can go down the line and pull from individuals. Even I feel like a lot of people were like, Eli Holstein needs to be benched after that game. And I think that's a very rash decision. I mean, even going back to the 3-9 season, Phil Jurkovic wasn't pulled until after game 5, or maybe before.
Which
game
maybe,
5.
Yeah, it was. I believe it was during a bye week. If I remember correctly, I think it was. They had one game in between the backyard brawl, which he was pretty bad, and then he played against Virginia Tech, and then they benched him in time for the Louisville game following a bye. So they did have some time to kind of work out. Christian Bayer, who ended up replacing him. Yeah. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, you're good. I appreciate it. I was not on the beat then, so I looked it up, but I did not have the context. And so I agree. I mean, and here's the thing is Eli has looked decent in every single game he has played. Maybe not actually looked, but his numbers are at least backing up his performance. And I think what I like that Narduzzi is doing is you're seeing little changes, nothing explicit, but in this week's depth chart, I think about the fact that At cornerback, Sean Lee Jr. is listed as a co-starter as a true freshman with a sixth-year Taman lineup. And that, to me, sends a signal of he's not afraid to make changes, but he's also just kind of dipping his toes in the water. We saw it also, he had over at wide receiver, Deuce Spann and Blue Hicks were now listed as oars, or so co-starters, and then all three tight ends as well listed as co-starters. And I think that is starting to send a signal, at least to me, that we recognize that there are positions that aren't as strong as we thought, and at certain positions, they have the depth that they can go down. And we see that a little bit with corner. I'm not sure how much better, if he is at all, Sean Lee is compared to Taman Lineham. But I like using the Deuce Spann over Blue Hicks analogy. Or not analogy, just because, Blue Hicks has been playing really well. But Deuce Spann had a really decent game last week too. And so they're almost on equal playing field to me. And I like that Narduzzi isn't being rash with these decisions. Because again, I don't think any of those players played horribly, lose their starting spot horribly. But, another game or two, maybe we get into that territory, and he's already kind of showing that he's willing to shake up.
Yeah. And it's a little complicated because there are, like you said, where do you have the depth? Where do you have the options to make changes? Offensive line, sure, you could try to throw Kendall Stanley in there at guard if you're really upset with the way Keith Gueva played. I don't know if that's necessarily the smartest idea in the world, given he has no real game action there. Kendall Stanley's primarily a tackle. Are you at the point where you could bench Ryan Berry yet? Kendall Stanley also hasn't played a ton of right tackle. At center, you've got, you consider Lyndon Cooper one of your best players, period. One of the more talented, upperclassmen guys on this team, has the potential to maybe get drafted if he can clean things up over this, final 3 quarters of the year. So, at the offensive line, at quarterback, I don't think there's a very obvious, hey, we can plug in a different player and we're going to be a better team because of it. That's maybe different at wide receiver, where, like you said, Blue Hicks, caught a couple touchdowns in the opener, hasn't done a whole lot for this team, in the 2 games since. That's not to say he's played poorly. I think there's some opportunities to get him the ball. He had that great 2-point conversion catch, but Deuce Spann has given you some stuff in the passing game as well. Just as much, if not more, than Blue Hicks has given you over these last 2 games. And he's also, I think, a much better blocker. He's much more physical. He's, got a better build to do that. He hasn't committed penalties in the same way that Blue Hicks has. Hicks has 2 penalties, both in the run game, I believe in blocking situations, maybe one on a screen and another on a run. So, if Deuce Spann is giving you just as much as a receiver without some of the penalties in the run game or in the screen game that you've been getting from Blue Hicks, then that's a pretty easy way to say, all right, Deuce, you're going to get a few more snaps that you might have otherwise given to Blue. There are certain positions that are easier to, I think, make changes. Like corner is another one where no one in really the entire secondary outside of Cruz Brookins has necessarily blown me away with their play. So, hey, why not throw Josh Garrier out there for a few more snaps? Why not get Kavir Baines? Sean Lee is clearly going to get some more time out there at that cornerback as well. So some positions that's easier to make changes than others, but it is not as simple as saying, okay, this guy didn't live up to expectations against West Virginia, so we've got to make some kind of change. Eli Holstein is the guy that they're going to roll with. This offensive line is going to be who they're going to roll with. We can maybe start to talk if we see similar things, against Louisville, against Boston College. Maybe you start to think about it going into that Florida State game in the middle of the year. But for right now, there aren't a ton of obvious places where you can say, personnel has been bad, and we have a solution waiting in the wings right now.
And I think we're getting into that conversation about depth, that they made such a key point through the offseason of building depth. And you're really seeing the areas that are the positions that did get really solid depth that you're able to rotate players. I mean, even at corner, we've seen a lot of Shadarian Harrison, and he got a little banged up against West Virginia, so who knows how much we'll see him. But it's like wide receiver, we knew was going to be a deep position. Tight end, we knew was going to be a deep position. Offensive line is kind of one of those positions that they have the depth, but do we know that how they would factor in if you actually had to play them? Where's the drop off? And I think we're at the time of year where we're really seeing, did Pitt put their money where their mouth is when it came to building that depth? And it's a blatant example of, some positions they really did build their depth, and you can tell. And other positions, it's a little bit harder because of numbers, the number game of everything. But there are a lot of positions out there that I'm like, I don't know if you could take out the one and there wouldn't be a drop off to the two.
Yeah, right. And, there's kind of two sides to that as well. Like, sure, you have to look at your personnel and understand that, if there was a guy who was obviously better than the first teamer on the roster, then he would be starting. So, the coaching staff looking at the roster, like, they have to kind of understand their priors and cross-check with what they've seen on the field. But, you got to kind of trust your evaluations from what you've seen in camp. And I think that's especially true with Eli, especially true with these offensive linemen. Like, you invested enough in them where you, to a certain extent, have to live and die with what they do. If that, that sounds a little final for, week 4 for a team that hasn't even started ACC play and is still 2-1, but their one loss coming in overtime. But you want there to be a sense of urgency because, like you said with Phil Dracovic a few years ago, like it was pretty clear well before when Pat Narduzzi actually pulled him that Phil Dracovic wasn't the guy. And I don't know if there are many positions, if any, really on this team right now where I am willing to, say definitively there is someone better than the starter waiting in the wings who you could plug in right now and have a much better, you would have won that West Virginia game, or you would have had you do have a better chance of beating Louisville this weekend. It's really not all that simple. And so I don't envy Pat Narduzzi having to walk that line as well. And, at the end of the day, everything does reflect on the head coach because, they like to be in control all the time. And when that's really great when things are going well, but it's not as good when things are going poorly. So some tough decisions for him to make, some tough evaluations to make. And to be honest, I don't know how many of these evaluations are going to reach conclusions especially before that Louisville game. I wouldn't expect we see lineups that are very different this weekend against Louisville, but we're gonna have a lot more real data after this week to work off of.
Yeah, and I gotta say, I just we rarely talk about the defensive line because we do not have to talk about the defensive line, and they're one of those positions that I think is like your ones and your twos are pretty equivalent, which is huge because you're seeing so much turnover, especially in the secondary of rotating who and who's going in and who's coming out. But like you said, more clarity coming into this week, more clarity from an injury standpoint too, since we get our injury reports starting this week because of ACC play, which will be huge because I know a lot of people have been asking me how Desmond Reid is doing, and until that injury report comes out, I'm not totally sure.
Yeah, and if I knew how Desmond Reid was doing, I would probably let everyone know. Exciting game this weekend, start of ACC play. Pitt opened as a 6.5-point underdog to the Cardinals. That line has since moved to 3.5 points in favor of Louisville. So, maybe someone knows something about Desmond Reid that we don't. Maybe our friends out in Las Vegas know something. Those odds come to you via FanDuel.com. So, it'll be interesting to see how this week progresses, what that injury report says, and how Pitt rebounds from their loss in the Backyard Brawl. Thank you all so much for joining us on another episode of the PG Pitt Show, brought to you by FanDuel. We'll be here all week delivering some more coverage, getting you ready for Panthers and Cardinals on Saturday at noon kickoff on ESPN2. Until then, make sure that you like this video, subscribe to PG Pitt on YouTube, follow all our written work at Post-Gazette.com, and we will see you all next time.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.
Another one bites the dust.
Oh shit! I gotta